to attend their annual Issues Summit. Until then, they'll continue working on the FAA reauthorization bill. A vote on an amendment to the bill is set for 10:30. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on CNN.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. O God, our strength, you fulfill the desires of those who trust in you. You are great in power and infinite in understanding. Give our lawmakers today a sense of your nearness. May they open their hearts to your presence, their minds to your precepts, and their wills to your providence. Remind them, Lord, that you are the source of their abilities and the one who opens doors of opportunity that will keep this nation strong. Dwell with them and make them productive for your glory. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 8, 2011, to the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jeanne Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will resume consideration of the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Bill. At 10:20, there will be a vote. At 10:20, there will be up to 10 minutes for debate equally divided on the Nelson of Florida amendment. That's amendment number 34 regarding NASA. Senators should expect a roll call vote at approximately 10:30 in relation to the Nelson, Florida amendment. It will be the only vote of the day. Today will be a short session in order to accommodate senators attending the Democratic Issues Conference. Madam President, I ask consent that Jeremy Parsons, a NASA detailee of Senator Bill Nelson, be granted privileges of the floor during the Senate's consideration S-223, the FAA reauthorization bill.
Without objection.
Madam President, I had a conversation last night with the Republican leader, and for all senators, we need to have amendments on this bill, the FAA bill, laid down. And we all know there's a lot of feigning going around here, a little posturing. The issue, we still have one issue left. It deals with slots at airports. It is not going to be resolved. We've worked on this for years, and it will not be resolved except here on the Senate floor. If it's not resolved and we don't have amendments laid down to take care of, I'm going to file cloture on this bill on Monday. It's a shame. I wish I could blame the Republicans for the impasse, but it's both parties. We have people on both sides of the aisle who are trying to take advantage, as they see it, on this slot issue. This is an extremely important piece of legislation. I know the slots to individual senators is important, but it is not important enough to hold up this bill. We've been trying for years to get this bill passed. This will create or save 280,000 jobs. It will improve the safety of our air travelers. It will give rights to people who are flying who don't have those rights. We have a Passenger's Bill of Rights. It is just a shame that this one issue is holding up this bill. I repeat, if we don't have this matter resolved Monday, I'm filing cloture on this bill. We've got to complete this legislation. We have, before we leave for our President's Day recess to go back into work in our states, we also have the FISA legislation that is a must. It expires. We've got to take care of that before we leave. And, of course, we have many other issues, but those are the two that I'm concerned about today. We've got to pass the FAA bill, and we've got to take care of the FISA legislation again. So I would hope everyone understands that we're not going to be playing around with this slot issue for another year. This bill has to pass. And there's one way we can solve it. People offer their amendments, and we will vote on it right down here. Well, there's no, I hear yesterday, there are meetings going on to try to resolve this issue. These meetings have been going on for months and months and months, and they've held up this legislation, and that's unfair. And so I tell everyone, we've got to move forward on this legislation, and if we don't have this issue worked out by Monday, I'm going to file cloture on this bill. It's a shame. I repeat, this is a bipartisan bill. This is not something that Republicans are trying to hold up or Democrats are trying to jam through here. This is a bill that Democrats and Republicans believe is for the best interest of our country.
Madam President,
The Republican leader.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President,
The Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
As the debate over spending gears up ahead of the President's budget next week, I thought it important that we just step back this morning and note one thing, and that's the fact that this debate has completely and totally changed. 2 years ago, the President and the Democrats running Congress weren't debating whether to cut spending. They were debating how much to spend. You recall that a lot of them were disappointed that the stimulus wasn't even bigger and that it ended up bigger than it ended up being. And some actually still are concerned that the stimulus wasn't big enough. So we've seen a welcome shift. Today, the only debate is how much to cut. It's a debate that Republicans and I think the vast majority of Americans are happy to have. And it's in that context that I wanted to mention the President's pledge to freeze his already outrageous spending levels for the next 5 years. And some troubling estimates we got yesterday about what that would mean for the deficit from the people whose job it is to analyze spending and debt here in Washington. In their monthly budget review, the Congressional Budget Office said that if the current spending levels are frozen at the same level as they are now, and Congress were to enact no other legislation affecting spending or revenues, the federal government would end the fiscal year with a deficit of $1.5 trillion, or about $200 billion more than the deficit Democrats ran last year. In other words, even if we don't add another dime to the current spending levels, the deficit will get even worse than last year. That's what would happen under the President's best offer, which is to lock in the dramatically higher spending levels from the past 2 years and put the budget on cruise control. The deficit wouldn't stand still. It would grow by $200 billion over the next several months. So yesterday's predictions by the CBO should be a wake-up call to anyone who thinks they can hide behind a spending freeze. This is a dire warning that business as usual is a recipe for disaster. If we don't immediately reduce the size and scope of the federal government, the deficit will be even bigger than last year's record deficit. So we have to get real. We need to listen to our constituents. Freezes aren't going to cut it. Madam President, I yield the floor.
I'm going to ask that the bill be reported.
I need to, under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-223, which the clerk will report.
Calendar 5, S-223, a bill to modernize the air traffic control system and so forth and for other purposes.
The Majority Leader.
I ask consent to set aside the pending amendments so that I can call up amendments numbered 54 and 55.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will report the amendments en bloc.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes en bloc amendments numbered 54 and 55.
The Senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendments so that I may call up my amendment number 49, which is at the desk.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Oh, the clerk will report.
The Senator from New Mexico, Mr. Udall, proposes amendment numbered 49.
Ask unanimous consent that the reading of the amendment be dispensed.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to insert my statement on this amendment in the record as if read.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendments so that I may call up another of my amendments, number 51, which is at the desk.
Is there objection? Without objection, so the clerk will report.
The Senator from New Mexico, Mr. Udall, proposes amendment numbered 51.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to insert my statement on this amendment in the record as if read.
Without objection.
And Madam President, just to conclude here, I want to thank our chairman of the Commerce Committee, Jay Rockefeller, both Chairman Rockefeller and Ranking Member Kay Bailey Hutchinson, I think, have done an excellent job on this FAA authorization bill. I don't have any doubt that they, working in the committee, have pulled us all together. And it's a remarkable bill because it is a job-creating bill. It's a bill that we need right now with the economic slowdown we have in America. The other thing this bill does that I think is very important is update the air traffic control system, and that's something that's terribly important. It's called Next Gen, and we're moving on to the next generation of air traffic control. It's important, I think, to remind people that we are behind the country of Mongolia when it comes to air traffic control. So it's very important that we get this bill passed, and I agree with Leader Reed when he said we can't be on this forever. We need to move it along, and I look forward in helping with that process. With that, I yield the floor.
Good morning, Madam President.
The Senator from West Virginia.
I want to reiterate some of what the leader has said and what the Senator from New Mexico has said, and that is the vast importance of this bill. I've said many times on this floor there are 11 million people who work for the aviation industry. That's only the direct jobs. There are probably 2 or 3 million indirect jobs. It's one of the major parts of our economy. Then here we stand after 17 delays, sort of kicking it down the road for 3 months, completely messing up FAA's ability to work with runways or make improvements or necessary. You know, you can't fiddle around with runways. If something goes wrong, they have to be fixed or people die. So the stakes are enormous. And this business of slots has become kind of a, I don't want to get rolled. I got to get my way. if I don't get my way, I'm going to look good back home. Or I'm up in 2012, and I can't do anything which in any way compromises the position that I had last year or the year before. Well, most everybody around here is up in 2012 on this side of the aisle, and it's just a decision people are going to have to make. Do they want to see a bill which fails, which goes down, and we go into our 18th extension, or 19th, whatever it is, I stopped counting, or do they want to see something which is major in the American economy, which is major in terms of NASA research, which is major in terms of air traffic control systems, and which is major in terms of passenger Bill of Rights? We have a lot of people stuck. I drove back from Clarksburg, West Virginia, to Washington on Saturday. And the reason I drove back is I was just so sick of that airline that comes out of Clarksburg getting canceled or having mechanical problems, which means they probably didn't have enough passengers. Because we're a small state, we often don't have enough passengers to meet the bottom line. So I just drove back, and it was 6.5 hours. That was fine. That was fine. I'm prepared to do that. I hate doing that. It's a waste of my time. But the stakes are here. It's huge, this bill. So we have one good amendment which we're going to do this morning with Senator Nelson of Florida comes down, and then I just think we have to proceed. I appreciate the majority leader being quite tough about all of this and saying he's going to lay down cloture. He doesn't want to fool around with this bill. There's only one part of this bill which is in any way contentious, and that's slots. And that has as much to do with personalities, campaign commitments, as it does with the good of the, much more to do with that than it has to do with the good of the nation. Nobody gets everything they want. In West Virginia, we get almost nothing. I don't complain. Sometimes I drive, but I don't complain because I understand we're at the end of the food chain because we're a little state. And whenever there's a recession or our airlines aren't doing very well financially because of fuel prices, we're the ones who get cut off. So my view about that is sort of more bitter, but more maybe widespread, and trying to look at the public good in general, because as the tide rises, all boats rise. So I would plead very strongly with people to consider the broader national interest and what an air traffic control system, which is digitalized, GPS, and which is 3 or 4 times more safe. I know whenever there's a near miss in the airways, when somebody hasn't calculated their distance correctly, either the pilot or the air traffic control. And I know about those things. They happen very frequently. There were several in the papers last week. And we're playing with life and death here. We're playing with the major exporter, by far the major exporter that the United States has to other countries in terms of products and goods. And yet people sort of want to have just what they want to have because that's what they said last year, and they can't back off because they look weak, or they're trying to protect a certain airline. This, to me, isn't about airline. It's about passengers. You know, the heck with airlines. Let's just talk about we need to have more passengers going west because the west is growing faster than the east. They're underserved. Out of D.C. Airport, there's 1 flight a day to Los Angeles. That doesn't make any sense. And so all of these things can be cured if people will be reasonable and not try to win out over some other group, some other constituency. I don't have a constituency. My constituency is the national interest in this bill. I don't mean to sound prudish when I say that, but I so say and feel very, very deeply. Madam President, if it's all right with the presiding officer, I'd like to recognize Ben Nelson, and he will make his amendment pending, and then debate on the other Nelson from Florida will start at about 10:20.
The senator from Nebraska.
Madam President, I call up the amendment that I just sent to the desk.
Is there objection? Without objection, the clerk will report.
The senator from Nebraska, Mr. Nelson, proposes amendment numbered 58.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the amendment be dispensed.
Without objection.
Madam President, the amendment that Senators Schumer, Dukakis, Shaheen, Tester, Whitehouse, Menendez, and I have offered is a common-sense approach to addressing the serious issue of protecting an individual's privacy when they pass through security checkpoints at both airports and public buildings. Senator Schumer and I have been working on this issue for some time, and I appreciate very much his input and his counsel in taking this approach, and I appreciate the support of the those who have additional sponsors, as well as the chair, who is one of those sponsors. By creating a deterrent and establishing criminal penalties for those who take and distribute body scan images inappropriately, will help protect the American people's privacy while making sure we're using every resource available to try and assure their safety at the same time. This is not an abstract concern. There's already been a case where these images, some 30,000 of them, have been taken and posted, some of them online, inappropriately. So it's my hope that this amendment and the other co-sponsors will help prevent that from occurring again. Madam President, by including this amendment in the FAA reauthorization, we're simply telling our constituents that we will not ignore their privacy in the process of making sure we have safe airports and federal buildings. That's what they're asking of us, and that's what we're going to deliver. So I ask my colleagues to support our amendment when it comes up for a roll call vote. And I yield the floor. Thank you, Madam President.
Previous order. There will now be 10 minutes of debate equally divided between the senator from Florida and the senator from Texas, the senator from Florida, Mr. Nelson, and the senator from Texas, Mrs. Hutchinson, or their designees. Time.
Yeah, I mean, I really have to do that. Huh?
Mr. President, Madam President,
The senator from Texas.
while the senators are getting ready to speak, let me just say that we have made good progress on the bill. I think amendments are now coming in, and cloture is going to be filed Monday, so we need to have all of the relevant amendments in by then. I just want to say briefly that I support Bill Nelson's amendment that we will vote on at 10:30. I think that we agreed really last year on this bill in a pre-conference meeting that the amendment that he has to drop language from the bill would be dropped, and I support the amendment. The NASA Reauthorization Act has intervened, and that is the law of the land. It was passed unanimously by the Senate, and I believe that Senator Nelson's amendment is a good one. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President,
The senator from West Virginia.
I yield some time to the distinguished senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
I thank the senior senator from West Virginia. I rise in support of Senator Nelson from Florida for his support of his amendment. He was tied up in committee, and I wanted to speak in support of it. It would strike Section 05, as Senator Hutchison said, from the FAA bill. Section 605 would establish an advisory committee on the future of aeronautics to, among other things, consider transferring responsibility for civil aeronautics research and development from NASA to other existing departments. The sole purpose is to take away aeronautics from NASA. That's simply unacceptable. It belies the very purpose of NASA in our nation's space and aeronautics mission. NASA stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. His amendment ensures that NASA stays that way. This is a question of maintaining our space, aeronautics, and economic competitiveness. Remember that one of our nation's top manufacturing exports And we don't export nearly enough manufactured goods. One of our nation's top manufacturing exports is aerospace, which includes civilian aircraft components. Ohio, my state, is a center for the aerospace industry. We make billions of dollars of components both for Boeing and for Airbus and for many other manufacturers. Section 605 would jeopardize America's dominance in aerospace. It would shift the very programs that have strengthened our nation's global leadership away from the experience and expertise at NASA. A consortium of nonprofits and colleges and private corporations and other government agencies can be effective and have been effective to promote public-private partnerships and economic development. But none of these entities, either by themselves or even working together, will ever be able to conduct aerospace and aeronautic research and development better than does NASA. Its fundamental aeronautics research capability is already fully integrated. It ensures the future success of the NASA space missions. Furthermore, Section 605 is in direct contradiction to the NASA Authorization Act of 2010, which reaffirmed that, quote, aeronautics research remains vital to NASA's mission and deserves continued support. Simply put, Section 605 jeopardizes not only the future of NASA, but America's dominance in the global aerospace marketplace. In closing, Madam President, NASA centers across the country are unique in their ability to leverage space and aviation systems through their experienced technical researchers. And these NASA centers in Cleveland and 9 other places around the country are stewards and operators of the nation's civil aeronautics R&D test infrastructure. I applaud Florida Senator Nelson for authoring this amendment and his leadership in the Science and Space Committee. I ask our colleagues to join Senator Hutchison and me in supporting that amendment. I yield the floor.
The Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I would like to yield to Senator Paul to allow him to put another amendment into the pending amendments so that we will have that done before cloture is filed.
Madam President,
The Senator from Kentucky.
I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendments and call up Amendment 18.
Is there objection? Without objection, the clerk will report.
The Senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes amendment numbered 18.
I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the amendment be waived.
Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from Kentucky.
the amendment that I am proposing is to continue to have the airlines exempt from OSHA. This isn't because I'm not concerned with safety. It's that we've been doing it this way for 30 or 40 years. The FAA voluntarily adheres to OSHA standards in their own manual. And I take the President and the opposing party at their word that they are concerned with adding frivolous paperwork and frivolous regulations when in reality we're not doing anything to add to safety since the FAA is already adhering to these standards voluntarily through their own manual. I would also suspect that the FAA may be a little bit better at learning to have their own safety manuals and regulations than would OSHA, since they specifically have been involved in this. So I would like to propose this amendment, and we would like to ask the body to vote against allowing OSHA to become involved in the FAA. And I will submit the remainder of my time back to the Senator from Texas.
Madam President.
Senator from Florida.
Madam President, do I need parliamentary inquiry? Do I need to set aside a pending amendment to bring up Amendment 34?
The amendment is now pending.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President.
Under the previous order.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, simply, others have already spoken on this amendment. It is to take unnecessary language in the bill that has been superseded by the NASA authorization bill that we have passed. Of the letters in NASA, the first A is aeronautics, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And aeronautics research is a big part of the NASA bill.
we have plussed up a lot of money for aeronautics research, and there is superfluous language in the bill about a study. Other studies have already been done. We want to get rid of that red tape. And so, Madam President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The yeas and nays are ordered.
We yield back any remaining time on our side.
The question is on the Nelson Amendment, number 34. The yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Ensign, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken,
Thank you. You too.
Mrs. Gillibrand,
I do. I appreciate it.
Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Carey, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen,
Aye.
Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter,
Hey, Lauren, it's Lee. Is Patrick in there? I'm not going to yell. I'm just going to give a gentle reminder. Thanks.
Mr. Warner,
Hey, Patrick.
Mr. Webb,
Murkowski bills you just brought me had their statements on
Mr. Whitehouse,
So I almost referred to statements, not bills.
Mr. Wicker,
Gentle reminder.
Mr. Wyden.
Oh, great.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Beckich, Brown of Ohio, Chambliss, Conrad, Cornyn, Ensign, Grassley, Hagan, Isaacson, Johnson of South Dakota, Lautenberg, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Paul, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, and Wicker. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Kyle? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Kirk? Mr. Kirk? Aye.
Hi. Ken got the Paul amendment, but I didn't get the Paul amendment. The last one, number 18, yes, I need a copy. I think I have them all. I didn't
Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Inouye? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson, Nebraska? Aye. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Johans? Aye. Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Brown in Massachusetts? Aye. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Cardin? Mr. Cardin? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Lugar? Mr. Lugar? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall, Colorado? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Webb? Aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Dement. Mr. Dement, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Akaka? Aye. Mrs. Hutcherson? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt? Aye.
It was close.